Hello. So, welcome to the show on Career Conversation. So, I have Kevin. Now, Kevin has been an old time friend. And if you remember in an earlier conversation, we had learned a lot about the German consulting industry from him. Now, what has happened is that Kevin has now shifted base to China, now become the part of the VC ecosystem there. So, he is now part of a startup accelerator there. So, in this conversation, we are going to look at more about what are the nuances of the Chinese market. So, welcome to the show, Kevin.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
So, Kevin, what prompted your shifting base to China from Germany? And right now, as we speak, you are in Singapore for this Chinese employer of yours.
Yes, right. So it was really just so it was two things. It was one thing that started very early. So when I was very very young and I went to the kindergarten, I always had a best Chinese friend. So I got actually confronted with the Chinese culture pretty early on, and I was very interested in it, and it fascinated me. But then really the switch that I said I want to go to China now and want to build a career there, it happened when I got more interested in economy and business, and I realized that China is becoming more and more important. When you watch news and you're not living under a rock, you probably notice that China technology, etc. It's all over the place. Some is controversial, but some is very valuable and good to learn from. And so I decided that at least for the next time, I want to uh, have a career in China. I want to build a career in China and want to witness the system, how it works, and learn as much from it. That doesn't mean that I'll stay in China forever, or that I think it's like my dream country. But it means that I think China is a place where you can learn a lot.
So, now what are you doing there in Shanghai exactly?
Yes. So what I did is in Germany back then when we talked the last time,
In Ronald
I
Berger. You
right
just
then
quit
I was
Ronald Berger.
right. So I was working at management consulting, and in parallel I co-founded a funding accelerator. So in Berlin we got very early stage startups in touch with early stage investors, and that kind of led to me becoming more and more interested in the venture capital space. And then I kind of formed the plan in my head to do venture capital in one of the most exciting markets of the world, where the total volume of venture capital is steadily rising, which is China. So I got in touch with a couple of contacts I had in China. One of them founded a pretty successful startup accelerator in China. So that was the point where I flew over. We talked. We had multiple rounds of discussions and negotiations, and then in the end, I was able to join this accelerator to be responsible for really building up their cross-border acceleration practice. So what I do is I help startups from outside of China get inside of China. So I quintessentially only deal with startups that are foreign startups, not Chinese startups, and that's precisely why I can work in China, because I am a foreigner and I am well suited to do that job.
So, now that you're into China, what do you think has been the major attractions of the Chinese market? So, the top three things why you would recommend China as an economy where one should engage in a profession or work on a startup. I mean, because Chinese markets, they have their own share of lack of democracy, and you talk about technology. So there are allegations that they do a lot of imitation. They
Yeah,
infringe on intellectual property rights in the technology space. So then,
yeah.
what still you like in this Chinese market? The sheer scale. What else?
Yes, so that's a very interesting question, and I would say there are really three things that I find very, very fascinating. And I totally agree with you. You know, there's lots of things to criticize. Like, let's make no mistake about it. The country still has to improve on multiple parameters. But let's talk about the positives. And for me, that's three things. So, first of all, China moves incredibly fast. So I have from what I know from Germany, you know, this seems like 10 times as fast. And already now that I have lived in China for some time, when I talk to my friends in Germany or in Europe in general, you know, it just seems like Stone Age, you know, it goes too slow. And I'm starting to even get really concerned, you know, like how is this going to play out over the next 10, 20 years? So that's point number one, you know, it's freaking fast. On the other hand, that's the second point, it's very hands-on. So I have Chinese and the Chinese people in my team, for example, when you give them tasks, I have not seen any like population or any culture that is so good in implementing, you know, in executing, making stuff happen. So if the instructions are clear, so to say, and if the plan is laid out, then Chinese are super well executors. That's fascinating to watch. And then the third thing, and that's maybe the most obvious thing, is just the technological improvement that's going on here. So when we talk about, you know, developments in AI or developments in medical tech, some Chinese companies are actually now you know, like back, like, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, Chinese strategy was just copying stuff, right? Now they're still copying a lot. Let's make no mistake about it. But what they do is they actually copy it and then take it to the next level. And that's fascinating to see and fascinating to, you know, immerse yourself in those different technologies that are really groundbreaking.
So, when you talk about their VC ecosystem, what are the hottest segments in terms of technology or other spaces? And are they like bootstrapped startups, or there's a lot of money in the air, like which is there in the Indian startup system, where VCs are just chasing any idea which is like scalable and which has a story behind it? So these startups are basically like more based on cash burn, or they are actually making real money?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So, first of all, for the industry verticals, I would say there are a couple of very interesting verticals. One being education tech, one being smart manufacturing. So within the industrial IoT sector, kind of smart manufacturing, medical tech, we already talked about very briefly, and clean tech. And the reason why these sectors are particularly interesting and particularly, you know, have a strong dynamic attached to them is because they are officially endorsed by the Chinese government. So Chinese government lay out a plan for technologies that are to be focused on and that are going to be supported by different government grants, etc., because they're in line with the strategy of the country. You know, I mean, for example, clean tech is very obvious, right? China, many of the Chinese cities have a big problem with pollution. So any startups that can solve these problems, they are going to get huge grants and be very successful. So these are some of the interesting, I would say, industry verticals. Now, for the investment activity, so I can speak from my experience. The startups that we work with are usually seed or pre-Series A, Series A startups around that range. And I must say, so of course we try our best to select the startups that, you know, already generating some revenues and that are in our eyes going to become profitable very soon. But in general, I think the VC, the total amount of venture capital in China is pretty high, and it's been rising very, very fast. And we actually saw a correction now. So in Q2 of 2019, we saw a strong correction, and the total amount of venture capital going down drastically in China. Yes, so compared to 2018, that was a strong correction. Of course, now we need to see how the rest of the year 2019 plays out, right? So I mean, those quarterly figures, sometimes they can be misleading, but it's a sign that it's a correction, and the total amount of venture capital was maybe a bit high, the valuations were a bit high, and there was a lot of money being thrown around without actually being invested in startups that are then going to generate profits. So I would say it's not an easy venture capital landscape. You definitely need to do your due diligence, and some of the valuations might be a bit ambitious.
So apart from as an outsider, I see an Alibaba doing very well, their Ant financial system doing very well, their the social media systems, which are the Badu and all that, is doing well. What are the big ticket names which have been the successful ones in the Chinese market, which have really zoomed in terms of valuation, made an impact?
Yeah, so you have companies like Douyin, so from Tencent. Many don't know about it, but it's actually TikTok. So
Yeah,
it's the
TikTok. It's
brand
now
that
in
gets
India also big time.
right, and it has a different name in Chinese, but for kind of Western market, they rebranded it, and they acquired this one, I think, Musically app, and merged it into their system. You have a couple of IPOs that are all over the news, but a lot of them also, I see, they are being driven by big investors like I mean, everybody knows about SoftBank driving up valuations, right? And
Yes.
probably this is part of their strategy to like drive up valuations, get out at the right point, and then nobody knows whether those startups will actually provide some value to this world at some point. So yeah, I mean, there is of course technology and innovation being done in China that's highly valuable, that's going to have an impact, and that's hopefully also going to be exported into the Western countries, which right now Chinese companies are still struggling with. So this first step of conquering their home market is something they do well, and then they are already massive companies, right? Because it's a market of 1.4 billion. But then the next step of really exporting those technologies, not many of them have managed to do that well. So that's also going to be exciting to watch.
Do you see the Indian oil rooms all around? So they claim to have made major strides in China. So the hoteling part, oil rooms.
No, actually, not that much. So I see that what I see is that Chinese companies are more and more becoming interested in the Indian market. So a couple of companies that are making moves into the Indian market, and I don't know how successful that is, and whether that's going to work well. Yeah.
The Indian ones going there.
Mm-hmm.
What about do you see Indian startups in China who set up shop?
To be honest, I don't see that many. So speaking from my perspective, when I work with startups, many applications from Russia. So from many applications from adjacent Asian countries, so from Singapore, from
Hong Kong.
Korea, Hong Kong. Um, Also, Australia is quite active because I mean they also don't have a domestic market, so they need
Yeah.
to export their technologies. I think Indian companies, I didn't see that many in the past, and to be honest, they also, I mean, they have a huge market, right? So I think many of them are still like they are
Conquering their
occupied.
own.
Yeah, they are conquering their own market, and once they have conquered this one, they don't need my help as a seed and series A focused investor. They will usually then have like huge valuations at this point, um, when they then decide to enter or expand into the Chinese market.
So when you talk about, there's so many kind of countries like Russia and Korea and Singapore companies setting shop in China, is language a barrier? Like Mandarin, is Mandarin the normal way of life there, or English is also made as much inroads as Mandarin?
Yeah, so language is definitely a barrier, and I can tell you when so I lived in China now for a while, right? And now 4 weeks ago I went to Singapore to open our new Singapore office. And when I arrived here, I realized that all the time it was a bit like I've been playing a video game on super difficult mode. And then when I came to Singapore, it suddenly switched to super easy mode. That's how it felt because everybody talks English. There is no need for VPN. Like I can just visit Google, Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp. There's no block, right? You don't have the Chinese firewall. And it's things like that that really complicate your daily life. And now back to the language. I would say Shanghai is the most international city by far. So if you look at the number of expats, etc., Shanghai is leading. But still, it doesn't feel like everybody speaks English. This is actually the older population doesn't speak a word of English, and the less educated ones, or I would even say just the top 10% or so of highly educated Chinese people, they speak English that's actually useful, so you can talk to them. So if you go into, just as an example, if you go to an H&M store, like, or a Zara store, right, to buy some clothes, they will probably not speak any English, and that's very normal. And then if you go to a restaurant, it's also only Chinese. So the people that I deal with, highly educated young Chinese people that work at my company, for example, they all speak English, more or less. But then you also have examples of old money Chinese people, like 60, 70-year-old guys who made their millions in the past. And of course, they also don't speak English. They are interesting for us as limited partners, so as investors in our business. But I can't deal with them because I don't speak fluent Chinese. So that's something that other people do. And so kind of to cut it short and answer the question, it's definitely an asset to speak Chinese here. And I would say 9 out of 10 opportunities are blocked if you don't, speak Chinese.
All right. So now that you had been in a consultant world, so you would have also tracked for sure the consulting market in China. So is it like McKinsey, Bain, BCG, and the Ronald Bergers, A.T. Kearney? They are the same players who are dominating the consulting space in China.
Yeah, so it's very similar. It's not like it's a totally different world. It's very, very similar. One thing though, that I noticed is everybody knows that, and now even more, there's kind of a clash between China and the USA, right? So those two countries, they have their differences, and that leads to a couple of things. But one of them is that European consulting firms like Roland Berger, for example, they are doing exceptionally well in China. So burger has an excellent market positioning in China, due to a number of reasons, but one of the reasons might be that for Chinese companies, they feel more comfortable, opening their data, etc., to a firm that is headquartered in Munich than to a deeply American-rooted firm. That being said, I think there are more similarities than differences when you compare the different consulting markets.
And what about the entry process? Like, is MBA the cult thing there also? Like, what are the top MBA college? Like, one is this CEBIS, which has been doing well. So, is the MBA the path to success?
Yeah. So you have a couple of things. So you have Chinese elite universities, right? So those are, for example, Tsinghua, Beida, the Beijing University. You have Fudan in Shanghai. You have Tongji, Jiaotong, universities like that. They are considered elite universities. And by the way, I think they are going to become more and more relevant in the future. So as kind of China continues its rise economically, those universities are probably also going to see a rise in popularity globally. But then you also have lots of Chinese, and actually that's the ideal that's the ideal thing to do for like the ideal elite Chinese, is to go abroad and mostly go, either to the UK, London Business School, or LSE, or go to the US, Stanford, Howard, Stanford, Wharton, whatever, right? And and then they come back, and then they all want jobs. And Chinese people, as I see it, they are entrepreneurial. So they have been growing up kind of in a society where, maybe their grandfather, he had like a small shop or something. So they have this entrepreneurial drive, but still they are also very much driven by reputations, and like outside reputation. So you have a lot of competition when you apply for the big consulting firms, or when you apply for the big investment banking firms. And Chinese people are they have a high willingness to pay for self-education, coachings, etc. So I know Chinese friends who offer coaching. Okay. Yeah. So the willingness to pay of Chinese people is extremely high. So I know Chinese friends who are offering a platform that gives coachings to people who want to break into investment banking firms. And it's not uncommon for them to charge 10 to 15,000 USD to conduct these coachings. And for the Chinese parents, they are like, yeah, okay, we're going to pay for that. It's the career of our daughter or the career of our son. We're fine with this. And that's generally the attitude towards coachings and education and all of these things. So that being said, of course, the market is extremely competitive, right? Because you need, like, if you don't take advantage of coachings, or at least you do lots and lots and lots of studying, you prepare very well for the interviews, you're not going to have a single chance, because you're competing against people who just spend a lot of money for coachings, etc.
So what do they teach in this investment banking course? Financial modeling?
Yeah, it's a nice business model, huh? Like when I heard about that, it's like that's some decent money that they earn. It's different. Like it's kind of like it's an end-to-end mentoring. So they start from the beginning. Like they give you a general overview of what you do and the different industry verticals of investment banks, for example, then they would help you choose which one is the right for you. Then they would help you write your CV and your cover letter. Some will even write the whole cover letter for you,
My God.
um, yeah, and then then it goes on. They send in the application. Sometimes they are able to get you in touch with people from the firm who will then forward your application. Then they prepare you for the interviews. They on the day before the interview, you have a last call with them. They prep you, and so it's really end to end. Even then, when you accept the offer, they give you advice on how to accept the offer and stuff like that. But they charge a hefty price for that.
Oh my God. Quite a lot.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
$15,000 is not a joke.
No, it isn't.
Okay, so the final question. Do you see
Yeah.
Indians getting opportunity either in the job market, in the entrepreneurs market in China?
Yeah,
Or
there is definitely Indians here that that are building a decent career for themselves. I think it's really just about the language. So um, as an Indian, you have two possibilities to get into the Chinese market. The one would be, okay, you speak the Chinese language pretty well and you are able to compete on all the industries and all the functions with Chinese people. That's nice, and then you are probably going to have lots of opportunities here. Or if you don't speak the Chinese language, then what you need to do as an Indian is you need to find those niches, those niches where you being an Indian actually provides an edge. So as a very simple example, you have a accelerator that focuses on cross-border acceleration between India and China. Then of course you are the man, right? Because you are the only one understanding how Indian culture works, how Indian startups think, how all of that works, and then Chinese firms are going to be begging for you to join them. That's of course just one example. There are multiple examples, but they are not very visible. So that's why if you're an Indian and you're looking to enter the Chinese market, it might make sense to just come over for 2 weeks, schedule as many coffees as possible with people, have 3, 4, 5 meetings with people per day and just talk to them. It's really about making those connections and then finding those sweet spots for you to play on your strength.
got it. Amazing. So as always, learned so much from the last half an hour or so. So thank you so much, Kevin, for being on the show. It's been a real pleasure understanding the nuances of the Chinese industry, the job market, the consulting firm, the startup space. So I'm really thankful for you for the opportunity. I'm sure the viewers of this show are going to love this. Thank you. All right.
Thank you for
Bye.
having me. All right. Bye bye.